discuss with y'all today, and I'm going to call this video the Septuagint to the Talmud. Now, the Septuagint was when the Jews, for Ptolemy, translated the Old Testament Hebrew into the Greek language. And what we'll find that being called when we read through different resources is they'll call it Hellenism, or they'll call it the Hellenistic Jews, who were under the influence of the effects that Alexander the Great had on the world that was known then. So Alexander the Great had subdued the Persian Empire, and the Persian Empire had absorbed the Babylonian Empire. And we find in Daniel chapter 2, we find that it describes it as a one unit, one body. And if you were to stick a timeline on there, you would say, okay, the head is the oldest and the feet are the most up-to-date, the present, the times we're in now. And I call that the snowball effect. I'm going to go ahead and erase this. So if you just write Septuagint, it means 70. And you'll often see it written as the LXX. So I wrote all this to get a little head start into the Talmud. Now the Talmud is Judaism, and that is their tradition, not Torah. Torah is the first 5 books of the Bible. We know that's true, but the Talmud was the different traditions of the elders. And that's why Jesus was confronting them. And that's what we're really getting at here. We're getting at explaining Jesus' words. And why did he say the things he said in Matthew chapter 5? And much of what is being expressed by Paul as well. And when he says that when Jesus says, except your righteousness exceed the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees, you shall no wise enter into the kingdom of heaven. And then he goes on to say, you have heard that it hath been said by them of old. You have heard that it hath been said. You have heard that it hath been said by them of old. Just over and over again. And what he's talking about when he says that, he's talking about their Talmud. And we're going to take a look at the collections of those writings, but we're going to start with the Septuagint since it's the oldest, just to kind of get a feel of what's going on. And so that whole system, that world system, from the Garden of Eden and the first sin, to Babylon, to Persia, to Greece, to Rome, to Roman Catholicism, to the Reformation, and the Protestantism, which is just a form of Roman Catholicism because they never got rid of that old system. It's all just here in the present. That whole Babylonian system is here in the present. The Persian, Greece, Rome, it's all here. It's here now. And that's what it's talking about in Revelation chapter 13, verse 11 and 12, when it says, and I beheld another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had 2 horns like a lamb, and he spake as a dragon, and he exerciseth all the power of the first beast before him, and causeth the earth and them which dwell therein to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. And that's speaking of Roman Catholicism, which was just a collection of those older religions there from Babylon all the way back to the Garden of Eden forward. And then now they worship it in the form of Roman Catholicism, which is why the Reformation is where Protestantism comes from, but it's really just still Roman Catholicism. You don't see the purity that was in with Jesus and the apostles. And that's why we're going to take a look at that timeline from the Septuagint. And now let's go ahead and read, because we know that that system is the voice box of Satan, serpent, devil, dragon, Leviathan, these kings, and this hegemony. Hegemony is actually a Greek word when it speaks of governors, and it's also an English word. So these governors and princes and these kings who think that they are the gods, and they think they can exercise their own judgment and their own power. And we know that God's in control of all of this, but what we as Christians look forward to is the coming of Christ and the destruction of this these spots, these rulers, these people who want to exercise lordship and exercise authority upon us and lord over the flock, like Peter says in 1 Peter. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to go ahead and open the Septuagint. If I can get it here. I got a few books kind of stacked together. Alright. So right in the beginning of the Septuagint, and as I said, we're reading this one first because it's the oldest. We have copies of the Septuagint. We'll call it the LXX because that means 70, and they call it the Book of Sevens. And we know that this goes back to at least 285 BC, before Christ. We have older copies of the Septuagint, as far as I know, and than any other scripture, because it's so old. The Septuagint is very old, and it was written in Greek, and that was, like as I said, that was the Greek version of the Old Testament. So that actually confirms the validity of the Old Testament for us, which is very important. It helps you understand that the Old Testament is genuine. It's not just a made-up book that was made in maybe 700 AD or along that right there. It's a old book, the Old Testament, and the Greek helps us confirm that. So I'm going to read to you here from the introduction from the Septuagint with Apocrypha from Brenton. This is the Septuagint. So in the introduction, it's explaining to you, it says, the earliest version of the Old Testament scriptures, which is extant in existence, or of which we possess any certain knowledge, is the translation executed at Alexandria in the 3rd century, so 285 BC, before the Christian era. BC. This version has been so habitually known by the name of the Septuagint that the attempt of some learned men in modern times to introduce the designation of the Alexandrian version as more correct has been far from successful. The history of the origin of this translation was embellished with various fables at so early a period that it has been a work of patient, critical research in latter times to bring into plain light the facts which may be regarded as well authenticated. So what's real? What's fable? What's made up? They know a lot of it's made up, but which parts are true? We need not wonder that but little is known with accuracy on this subject, for with regard to the ancient versions of the scriptures in general, we possess no information whatever as to the time or place of their execution, or by whom they were made. We simply find such versions in use at particular times, and thus we gather the fact that they must have been previously executed. If then our knowledge of the origin of the Septuagint be meager, it is at least more extensive than that which we possess of other translations. Amazing. It's old. And they know it's old. After the conquests of Alexander had brought Egypt under Macedonian rule, so Alexander the Great, when he had defeated Egypt, and Persia and Babylon had been the previous people in control of the known world of that time until Alexander the Great took over. So it says, after the conquest of Alexander had brought Egypt under Macedonian rule, Greece, the newly founded city of Alexandria became especially a place where the Greek language, although by no means in its purest form, was the medium of written and spoken communication amongst the varied population there brought together. The Alexandrian dialect is the idiom in which the Septuagint version was made. Amongst other inhabitants of Alexandria, the number of Jews was considerable. Many appear to have settled there even from the first founding of the city, and it became the residence of many more during the reign of the first Ptolemy. Many more Jews moved there to Alexandria and Egypt during the reign of Ptolemy. Hence, the existence of the sacred books of the Jews would easily become known to the Greek population. So they were aware of that. And as we said, that was the Septuagint with Apocrypha by Brenton. So they began to come there with their sacred books. And what we're going to find out from reading from John Lightfoot is he's going to explain that they were suspicious. Ptolemy was suspicious. So Ptolemy was one of the generals of the Didache, or the Diadache. Now the Diadache, if you read in Daniel chapter 7, verse 6, let me see. So if you'll open to Daniel chapter 7, in Daniel chapter 7, verse 6, it says, "After this I beheld, and lo, another like a leopard, which had upon the back of it 4 wings of a fowl. The beast had also 4 heads." And that's speaking of the 4 generals under Alexander. "And dominion was given to it." Okay, so that's what I wanted to share. And I also want to share with you verse 5. So let's back up one verse. It says, "Behold, another beast, a second, like to a bear. And it raised up itself on one side, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth, in the mouth of it, between the teeth of it. And they said thus unto it, Arise, devour much flesh." Now the bear is Persia, and the leopard is Greece, and the bear had 3 ribs. Now, we're going to read and explain what those 3 ribs are real quick. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this. Or delete that computer age. I'm going to erase that. Wow, that's interesting. So, it says right here, it says the 3 ribs between his teeth. It says, and this is in the Jamieson Fawcett Brown commentary, and I'm looking in the verses we just mentioned in Daniel chapter 7, and he says the 3 ribs in its mouth are Media, which are countries near Babylon, Media, and that's why you often hear it called Media Persia, Lydia. So I might have said Babylon on accident a minute ago. The bear is Persia, and it has 3 ribs in its mouth. Sorry if I said Babylon. And Babylon, and the reason that's significant is because Persia took over those places. It absorbed those empires. It says, brought under the Persian sway, rather Babylon, Lydia, and Egypt, not properly parts of its body, but seized by Media Persia. So some people will say one of those ribs was Egypt. Rather, so it says, and that was Sir Isaac Newton who said that. Sir Isaac Newton wrote more on theology than he did on science, and he was the one who discovered the gravity, Newton, right? He came up with the formula and the calculus to explain gravity, and he did it at age 23. But he actually had his theology all through his writings on gravity as well. And he said that God was the one who's made the things balance the way they were. He gave God the credit. It says, called ribs because they strengthened the Medo-Persian Empire between its teeth as being much grinded by it. So the Persian Empire subdued them and grinded it because its system. So it goes on to say, a little bit later, it says that Macedonian Empire was divided at the death of Alexander. It says, viz. Macedon and Greece under Cassander, Thrace and Bithynia under Lysimachus, Egypt under Ptolemy, and Syria under Seleucus. So right there we have the 4 wings that in the 4 heads is describing. It says 2 wings. Hence, whereas Babylon is represented with 2 wings, Macedon has 4, so rapid were its conquest. The various spots denote the various nations incorporated into his empire. So we talk about how spots mean different rulers. And it says, are Alexander's own various in character, at one time mild, at another cruel, now temperate, and now drunken and licentious, 4 heads. So, as we said though, the 4 heads, So it says that the two wings denote that, or the four wings of the leopard denote that it was fast. So, or because it was so rapid in its conquests. So the Didache is what it's known as, and it's those four generals. And I'm going to write them up here just so you'll know. It is Cassander, and these were the ones who are the four heads again, because when Alexander the Great died, these took over his empire. So Cassander, I want to make sure I spell it right. And Lysimachus, Ptolemy, and Seleucus. So these are known as the Didache, and these are the four heads that the empire is divided under. So now we're going to zero in, and we zeroed in on Ptolemy just then because that's who the Septuagint was translated under. Now, what you have to understand is that, whoa, my books are falling. So what you have to understand is that in 722 BC, northern Israel was carried into Babylon, Assyria. Assyria had came down and conquered northern Israel, and in 586 BC, before Christ, southern Israel was carried away by Babylon. So northern Israel was conquered in 722 BC by Assyria, and southern Israel in 586 BC was carried away by Babylon. And when they were carried away, that's when the system of the synagogue was started. The synagogue. And that's also known as the diaspora. Because they were scattered into all the country. And they invented the synagogue system. And that's where you get the term rabbi. And rabbi means master. And that's also where you get the word. So let me write that a little bigger. So you got the synagogue. And you got the rabbi, and plural of rabbi is rabbin. Not rabbins, but rabbin. And that's what they started because they had been carried away into foreign lands. And one of those foreign lands, as we can see, was Ptolemy in Egypt. And if you're a king and you have all these people coming over and they have a particular religion, you're going to want to know what they believe, right? So the Septuagint was a book written for Ptolemy because he wanted to know what they believe, right? And if you know anything about the Jewish religion, they didn't just want to give what they would consider pigs or swine, right, or dogs. They wouldn't want to give them their holy book, as we're going to find out when we read some from a history of the Jewish people in the time of Jesus Christ, and by Schurer, and then also from John Lightfoot. And this book is called Commentary on the New Testament from the Talmud and Hebraica by John Lightfoot. Alright, so now that we're speaking of the synagogues, and we're going to look at how, and what we're going to look at is we're going to see how all of this converged. How did the Jewish synagogue, which is Judaism, and how does the Septuagint and the Talmud converge? How do all of these different writings all kind of get mixed together? And we know that Jesus in Matthew chapter 5 was rebuking them because of these traditions that came out of the synagogue. And they had been wrapped up in this writing called the Talmud, but they had already been in the works as far back as 722 BC and 586 BC. They had already been in the works of these different traditions and these different concepts that were not inspired, that God in the Old Testament did not say was okay. And that's when we have Jesus on the scene. He rebukes them for following the traditions of their elders and coming up with these different ritual washings and making one proselyte. And these different things that were just made up by men. It's much the same. It's the way it looks like today is the way that people have their commentaries, and they'll read these men's commentaries, and they'll never even understand what the Bible's talking about because of these people who want to sell books, the people who control publications. And they're not firing off at the people who need to be fired at, because if they did, they wouldn't sell books. Book selling, that's what's important to the world, right? Money. It's all about money. Power, position, acclaim, laudation, being clapped for, adulation, having people look at you. Like the scripture speaks of Diotrephes, who love to have the preeminence. Alright, so now let's go ahead. Now that we've discussed the Septuagint, and that was written in about 285 BC, maybe a little before, maybe a little after, it was already in the workings. And then we discussed about how in 722 BC and 586 BC, a couple hundred years before that translation began to take place, because Assyria, Babylon, and Persia and Greece were all of these Gentile kings who would trample the Jews underfoot. So when Jesus shows up, they had wanted to be liberated from these Gentile rule and the oppression. And that's why even in Mark chapter 10, verses 42 through 45, when they ask, who will be greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Well, they were starting to act like the very thing they had come to despise, which were these kings and these nobles and these princes who kept exacting these taxes from them and making them pay heavy taxes and these heavy burdens, and they couldn't stand it. They really hated the tax collectors, because they would take the taxes and then they could pinch some off the top and they would live deliciously, and then they would send the taxes to Rome. And that's why they didn't like Rome. That's why they didn't like Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. They were Gentiles. They didn't believe in Yahweh. And so you begin to see how these synagogues and these different translations, like the Septuagint, they were concerned about the Word of God being corrupted. But at the same time, in many ways, they were corrupting it themselves by turning all these things into their own traditions. Like you may have heard that they even forgot how to actually pronounce the name Yahweh. They forgot how to even say their God's name, because they made this tradition. That's why you have a capital L-O-R-D everywhere Yahweh's name is mentioned, because they began to keep these traditions. So now let's look at some of these divisions of the synagogue and the rabbis' books, which were the Talmud. Now, I'm going to go ahead and write this up there. You had the Halakhah. You had the Haggadah. You had the midrash. And you had the Mishnah. And these writings here became collections. They put them all together and they organized them. They had their little subcategories and categories, like a table of contents. They made their own table of contents, their own categorization of it, and their little form so they could index the information as in like a form of a catalog. And that all became absorbed into the Talmud. So oftentimes when we talk about this, you're going to see how sometimes these are kind of interchanged a bit. They're kind of sometimes when you speak of the Halakhah and the Haggadah, you are talking about what went into the Talmud, and the Mishnah is what went into the Talmud. So when you speak of the Talmud, you're speaking overall about these, and some of that was some of it was called the Gomorrah. And as the languages changed because of those different empires that took over, whether it's Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome, you see how the language began to shift in the different Jewish writings. And this is what Jesus was preaching against because of the Pharisees and the Sadducees and their false doctrine, their false teaching. A bug keeps flying around me, sorry. So these false teachings were from the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and that was their traditional law. That's why I believe it's Mark chapter 7, when he's talking about the washing of the hands, he says it's not what comes from without that defiles a man, it's what comes from within. He says you reject God that you may keep your tradition. He says you make the word of God of none effect by your tradition. So let's go ahead and look at this. Alright, so we're going to look at who John Lightfoot is real quick. It says, during the Middle Ages, the Talmud was the exclusive property of the Jews. Tragically, it was not even allowed to be their property, for the persecutions of the Jewish heretics, and later of the Protestant heretics too, extended also to their sacred books. As a consequence, very few manuscripts of the Babylonian and Jerusalem Talmud survive. So that's an important fact. There was a Babylonian Talmud and a Jerusalem Talmud. While the revival of Hebrew and the study of the Hebrew Bible that came with the Reformation, there came also an interest in other Jewish works. One of the fine fruits of this movement was the work of the Hebraist John Lightfoot from 1602 to 1675. So he was alive when King James translated the Bible. Or when King James, the private censorship committee, the bishops, and the Oxford and Cambridge translated the Bible, and they foisted in those false terms like we talk about all the time, like church, office of a bishop, and deacon, and these different words that could have been betterly translated to what they mean, rather than to keep an illusion going of this hierarchical system in the world. Lightfoot was one of many earnest Christian scholars of his time, master of St. Catherine Hall, Cambridge. He possessed the classical learning of those days. He was at home in Latin and Greek, and he was a master not only of classical Hebrew, but also of Mishnaic Hebrew and the Aramaic of the Talmud. We are reminded of his elder contemporary, Lancelot Andrews. And if you read God's Secretaries by, I can't think of his name right now, the guy who wrote God's Secretaries, the making of the King James Bible, he actually talks about Lancelot Andrews in there because he was one of the translators. So it says one of the translators of the King James Version of the Bible who composed prayers for himself in Hebrew. And now we're going to get into a little bit more. And this introduction here is by R. Laird Harris. And R. Laird Harris was one of the writers of the Old Testament, the theological word book of the Old Testament. You'll often see it abbreviated as TWOT, the theological word book of the Old Testament. R. Laird Harris, he's the one doing this introduction that I'm reading from right now in John Lightfoot. So now we're going to look at the actual Talmud and see how it's divided into these different writings. So he says, there are probably two dangers in Talmud study, the one of underemphasis, the other of exaggeration. The Talmud is a compilation of Jewish tradition from early medieval times. The unanswered and likely unanswerable question is how accurately this tradition reflects early times. Doubtless a part of this tradition is valid. The question is, which part? In form, the Talmud is an interpretation and application of the Mishnah and the Mishnah of the Pentateuch. So the oral commentaries of the rabbi, or the rabbin, on the Pentateuch, which is Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, in their own commentary. That's like buying a book, the ESV by John MacArthur with his notes, or the ESV with R.C. Sproul's notes, or the commentary by this really important guy, and rather than obeying God and listening to what God has to say. So it says, after the close of the Old Testament canon, when Jews were conscious that prophecy had ceased, leaders of Jewish thought were faced with questions of ethics and practice that demanded new applications of the law. So don't keep the old that God commanded. Let's make our own thing here. What? New applications of the law? God didn't say to change his word and come up with a new application. He said, do what I command you. This is exactly the problem that Jesus is facing head on, and why they're going to kill him is because he's saying, don't listen to this false doctrine of Herod, and he thinks he's a king, he thinks he's a real important guy. God struck him dead. Remember that? He stands up and he gives this long, eloquent speech, and the men are like, this is the voice of a God. And God strikes him dead because he didn't give God credit. And the leaven of the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the scribes is their doctrine and their hypocrisy, the scripture says. At one place it says doctrine, at one place it says hypocrisy. They judge for themselves. They said, we're going to change the law because our civilization is changing, and we're going to interpret the Torah to mean what we want it to. So we can keep whatever we want with this new, it's like the emergent church, right? This new contemporary and modernized church. We're going to change God's word so it will jive with the new upcoming things that are relevant to today. Moral relativism, right? No, God says keep what I said from back then. These precedents were discussed by generations of scholars called Tannaim, and their deliberations became a body of traditional opinion in about AD 200. So, we were looking over here at BC, before Christ, 285 BC. And now we're speaking of as late as about 500 AD. So several hundred years, about 800 years. We're speaking of about 800 years here. So it says, in about AD 200, these oral traditions were written down in the Mishnah in 6 divisions called orders. The Mishnah, 6 divisions called orders, comprising 63 chapters. So, 6 divisions called tractates, 6 divisions called orders, comprising 63 tractates. These were written in a late dialect of Hebrew called Mishnaic Hebrew. As time went on, more discussion gave rise to more precedents, and these discussions of later generations of scholars called Amoraim, like the Tannaim were discussed earlier with those writings, and now Amoraim were written down in the Aramaic. These Aramaic chapters, Gemara, were appended to the paragraphs of the Mishnah. So you have it down at the bottom as footnotes. So the Talmud has a paragraph of Hebrew followed by Aramaic commentary. It was written down around AD 500. AD 500. The Talmudic manuscripts that survived, written down around AD 500 in 2 recensions, the Palestinian or Jerusalem Talmud and the longer and more widely used Babylonian Talmud. So there was 2 that were put together, the Palestinian or Jerusalem Talmud and the longer and more widely used Babylonian Talmud. It will be observed that the Jews did not begin to write down these traditions until AD 200. So that's when they first started, in AD 200. And they say that this goes all the way back to these carrying off here in the diaspora, when they started to write these, come up with these synagogues. So, and the Talmud was not completed until 500 AD. The Talmudic manuscripts that survived the medieval burnings of Jewish books are few and come from the late Middle Ages. Therefore, they should be used with some caution in interpreting the New Testament. The New Testament histories were written down within one lifetime of the death of Christ, most of them within about 40 years. The majority of Pauline epistles at least are admitted to be genuine and therefore were written down before the 60s by a man who knew Jerusalem and Jewish thought very well. We have extensive portions of the New Testament in copies made around 200 AD. It is very precarious, therefore, to use these late Jewish traditions to bring into question early Christian accounts written by eyewitnesses like Matthew and John. On the other hand, such early Jewish customs and institutions as these Jewish documents reflect may frequently furnish a background against which the New Testament can be more fully understood. Lightfoot has used these documents judiciously. He has also used extensively the work of Jewish historian Josephus, who wrote around AD 90. Josephus even witnesses in his book, his history, that Jesus was the Christ. In 90 AD, Josephus wrote about that. The work of this older scholar is worth our close attention. Josephus. It's awesome. All right, so now we have a better idea of the divisions and the creation of these different writings that came from the traditions of the elders, the traditions of the Jews, Judaism. And in those writings, in those Talmud tractates, it's all open-ended. It's very much of it explains is for argument. And the scriptures say we're not supposed to argue because they leave it open-ended so you can argue with them. It's inviting you to step into the argument. And that's what it calls the dialectic. Now, the dialectic isn't necessarily bad because it invites you to ask questions. But the argument is where it's bad. We're not supposed to argue. But the dialectic, and some of the things in the Talmud would certainly be true, right? I mean, you can't write volume and volume and volume after book and not somehow accidentally write something that's true. Just like when you get into John MacArthur, R.C. Sproul, John Piper, and it goes on and on and on, right? Some of the things that they write are true, but much of it is written because they're trying to sell a book. So they're not going to tell you the whole truth, or they wouldn't have book sales. You got to appeal to the church system, and the church system of these hierarchical overlords, which was invented by men like Ignatius and some of these early people like Cyprian and Tertullian and St. Augustine. I mean, they worship these guys. They don't listen. Half the time they don't listen to what Jesus said when he says, you're not going to exercise authority or exercise lordship like the Gentiles. And that's exactly what Peter said. You're not going to be a bishop in other men's matters. He says, allos episkopos, saying that you're going to, or allotruos episkopos, saying you're going to look into other men's affairs. No. You help your brothers. You love your brothers. That fulfills the law. That's the royal law James talks about. That's the royal law spoken of in Romans 13. The whole law is comprehended in this. Love your brother. Love God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind and all your strength. Treat your brother as yourself because you love God. So it's also called the Socratic Method. And like Jesus died for the same reasons as Socrates, because he asked questions. He questioned the establishment. He questioned the government, Herod, and he questioned their schools, Hillel and Shammai. Hillel was where the Pharisees were from, and the Sadducees were from Shammai. The Hillel took over, of course, because it was the more liberal one, and Shammai, the more conservative, was the Sadducees. And this all is the same concept as what Eve came up with, these commentaries and these own interpretations and your own laws. It's what Eve did. Be wise in your own conceits. She brought the food back to Adam, and they came up with their own decision of right and wrong was the judgment. The king, they were powerful in their own eyes, mighty in their own sight, rather than obeying Yahweh. That's why we listen to Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is Yahweh incarnate, and he came to set the record straight. And we're his body. He's our head. The head is in the heavenlies. The body's on the earth. The head can't be without the body. The body can't be without the head. Where the head is, there's the body. Where the body is, there is the head. We pray on earth as it is in heaven, right? And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And God said, let there be light. We must be born from above, born again. Everything that's good comes down from the Father of lights. It's first pure, peaceable, without hypocrisy. And that's the seed of God that dwells in us. All right, so now we're going to look a little more into the Septuagint, and we're going to read in the appendix of John Lightfoot about the Septuagint. Because we're going to see how in the New Testament, many of the quotes that are used there are from the Septuagint. So he says, in the appendix, it says chapter 11, by what authors and councils it might probably be that Greek version came forth, which obtains under the name of the 70. 1. It was made and published without doubt, not for the sake of the Jews, but of the heathen. We have Josephus, a witness here in his story of the 70, granting him to be true in that relation. What moved Ptolemy so greedily to desire the version, to purchase so small a volume at such vast expense? Was it religion, or a desire of adorning his library? By that paint does Josephus color the business. But reason will dictate a third cause, and that far more likely. For both the Jewish and heathen writers teach that Egypt at that time was filled with an infinite multitude of Jews. And what could a prudent king and that took care of himself and his kingdom do else than look into the manners and institutions of that nation, whether they consisted with the peace and security of his kingdom, since that people was contrary to the manners and laws of all other nations. The Jews, right? They wanted to obey Yahweh in whatever nation they went to. They didn't want to follow the same laws as these wicked nations that don't give reverence to Yahweh. When, therefore, he could neither examine nor understand their law, which comprised their whole religion, polity, and economy, being written in Hebrew, it was necessary for him to provide to have it translated into their vulgar tongue. Hence arose the version of the 5 elders, as we may well suppose, unless some fraud or collusion might creep in. The assembling of the 72 elders was occasioned hence also. And does it not savor of some suspicion that he assembled them, being altogether ignorant what they were to do? For let reason tell us why we should not rather give credit to the Talmudist writing for their own countrymen, than to Josephus writing for the heathen. And if there be any truth in that relation, that when he had gathered them together, he shut them up by themselves in so many chambers, that still increaseth the same suspicion. 2. Let it be yielded that they turned it into Greek, which, as we have seen, is doubtful, yet the speech in the Gemmaris is only concerning the books of Moses, and concerning the law only in Josephus, who therefore translated the rest of the books of the holy volume. It is without an author, perhaps, should we say, the Jerusalem Sanhedrin, but not without reason. So you see how he's talking about this. He's saying the Jews were taking care of themselves by doing this translation, because Ptolemy wasn't going to let millions of people live in his land not knowing what they believed and not knowing what they were up to. And he's saying the Jews were going to do the minimal amount that they needed to just to pacify the heathen, not to give them the secrets of their religion, is the ideas that are going to be conveyed here. So 3, for the Jews, wheresoever dispersed throughout the world, and they in very many regions, infinite in their numbers, made it their earnest request that they might live and be governed by their own laws. And indeed, they would live by none but their own. They'd be killed before they do the laws of where they live. Even though we see how they changed the laws to make it convenient for themselves in certain aspects in the Talmud. That's why they're talking about the Gomorrahist here, the Jerusalem Sanhedrin, those different concepts there. So, might live and be governed by their own laws. And indeed, they would live by none but their own. But what prince would grant this, being altogether ignorant what those laws were? They saw their manners and rights were contrary to all other nations. It was needful also to see whether they were not contrary to the peace of their kingdoms. That very jealously could not but require the version of those laws into the common language, and to force it also from them, how unwillingly soever they might be. The great Sanhedrin, therefore, could not consult better and more wisely for the safety and security and religion of the whole nation than by turning their holy books into the Greek language, the Hellenistic influence, that all might know what it was that they professed. They could not but see but those books would at last, though they were never so unwilling, come forth in the vulgar language, the common tongue, like the Greek koine. Koine means common, vulgar means common. In English, when we say vulgar, you think of something bad, but it just means common language. Nor could they hinder, but they would everywhere happen into the hands of the heathen. So the heathen would get a hold of what they were writing. And vulgar is the Latin word vulgate, and that's why the Latin vulgate means vulgar, the common tongue. Therefore, that it would be far better that a version should come forth by their care and authority, the Jews, which might be according to their pleasures, than that some should come forth in one place and some in another, which perhaps might turn to the disgrace of the holy text, or to the danger and reproach of the nation, or might too much lay open the holy mysteries among the heathen. So hiding it, taking care of yourself. Watch out for number 1, right? That's kind of the ideas that's being conveyed here. By these authors and by these reasons, I confess ingenuously, it is my opinion that that version was made which goes about under the name of the 70. Nor are there some things wanting in the version itself which hint some such counsel in the publishing of it. So everything he just said, he's saying, I, from my studies, have seen that this is why they did this. For even a Blair eye may see clearly enough that it was hammered out and dressed with more caution than conscience, more craft than sincerity. 1, that as much as might be, the holy books might remain free from any reproach or cavilling of the heathen. 2, that they might soften some things which might be injurious to the Jewish nation, either as to their peace or reputation, or which might create offense to the Gentiles, the heathens. 3, that the mysteries and the bare truth of the holy book might be revealed as little as possibly could be to the heathen. All which might be demonstrated by such numberless examples as leave no occasion to doubt of that matter behind it. By these and the like cautions and subtleties was that version made, wherein the translators had less care that the interpretation should come out sincere and true, but provision was chiefly made that anything should be thrust upon the Gentiles, so it were without danger, and that the glory and safety of the Jewish nation might be maintained. And may it be allowed me to speak out what I think? Among the various copies and editions of this version which go about, I do not esteem that copy for the most genuine which comes nearest to the Hebrew text, but that which comes nearest to the mind of the translators and such like cautions. It is said, as we saw before, that when the 5 elders had turned the law, that day was bitter to Israel when they translated it, right? As the day wherein the golden calf was made. And why? Because the law could not be turned according to all things convenient to it. Did their grief arise hence? Because it was not turned, nor could not be clearly, exactly, and evidently enough that the heathen might see the full and open light of it? Who will believe that this ever was the Jews' desire or wish? But their trouble proceeded rather from hence, that those 5 had not translated it cunningly, warily, and craftily enough, as the Gentiles were to be dealt withal. Of this matter there was care enough taken in this version, the authors setting all their strength and wits on work, that according to their own pleasure it might come forth such as they would have it, and might serve their purpose both as to themselves and as to the Gentiles. This they established and strengthened by their own authority, not as a pure version, and such as was to be recommended to their their countrymen, but as fit enough to stop the mouths and satisfy the curiosity of the heathen, and lest any among them might attempt another, in which those cautions and provisions might not be sufficiently observed. This they laid up in their Sanhedrins and synagogues, that it might be ready and shown to the heathen as a symbol and token of the Jewish law, faith, and religion, if at any time the matter and necessity called for some such thing. We grant therefore to Justin Martyr that version was in the synagogues and hands of the Jews, but one would not conclude that from that it was read in the synagogue instead of the Hebrew text. And we will yield also to Tertullian that version was read at Rome in his age in the synagogues of the Jews, but being compelled so to do by that suspicion whereof we spake, namely that it might be known to all what the law and religion of the Jews was, whether it consisted with the Roman government. Our question is whether the Hellenists chose to themselves the reading of the Greek version and neglected the Hebrew text. And seeing for the most part they lived by their own laws and ordinances, you will hardly anywhere show me, especially in the time of the apostles concerning which we speak, or in the times before them, that they were compelled to reject the one and to read the other. Reject the Hebrew and read the Greek, right? No. He's saying, no way. And as to that which is objected concerning Philo and Josephus, it is no wonder if they, writing for the heathen, followed that version which was designedly made for the heathen. But that is of the greatest weight of all, which is objected concerning the evangelists and apostles who embraced that version in their quotations out of the Old Testament. So the New Testament often quotes the Septuagint. To which the answer is very easily, namely, those holy writers had to do with 2 sorts of men, Jews and Gentiles. The volume of the New Testament was in the hands of both. A Gentile desired to examine the quotations which are brought out of the Old Testament, but not understanding the Hebrew, whither should he go but to the Greek version, which he understands, so that it was not only ex sub kata basios, out of condescension, that those holy writers followed the Greek version, but out of pure necessity, for otherwise it was impossible that their allegations out of the law and the prophets could be examined by the Gentiles. And if a Jew having the New Testament in his hand should complain and quarrel that in their quotations they departed from the Hebrew text, they had an answer ready, viz., this very version which is cited is that very same which ye have written, published and propounded to the world as a symbol and token of your law and religion, and as your own very Bible. So what he's saying is the Greeks would use the Old Testament because the Old Testament in the Greek, because they would have to, or the Greeks would read the Old Testament in Grecian because they would have to. Now the Jews would write to the Greeks in the Greek tongue, and if the Jews said, well, why are you writing the Greek tongue? They'd say, well, that's what you made for them, right? So that's what we'll use. So it goes on. If we would designedly attempt a full disquisition concerning that version, we might, it may be, more at large demonstrate all these things which have been spoken by various instances, reasons, and methods. But let this suffice at present. This discourse was raised by occasion of the mention of the unknown tongue, chapter 14 of Corinthians, right? Which we suppose was Hebrew, formerly used in the Hellenistic synagogue of the Corinthians, and which they would retain, being now converted to the gospel. Too much resting to Judaism the gift of tongues in the same manner as they did the other privileges and ordinances of the gospel, and using an unknown language so much the rather because the gift of tongues was granted from heaven, using it to an end plainly contrary to the gift itself, unhappily perverting it and not requiring, now admitting, now an interpreter, which before was done by them, as if they thought God had given unknown tongues to be unknown to all besides those to whom they were given. And what I have said of the Greek version and of the not reading it among the Hellenists, I know I have very learned men differing in their opinions from me, and heretofore I myself was of a contrary judgment, whence I hope the reader will be the more easily persuaded that I do not speak these things from a desire of contention, but from a serious inquiry, as far as I am able, into the thing from often repeated thoughts, and a most hearty desire of searching after truth. So that's just very interesting writing there. And so when the scripture says tongue, it's talking about language. Now they've turned that into a ridiculous concept today in the times we live in, of people going like, right? And they call it like an ecstatic utterance. But that's just baloney, is what that is, because in Acts chapter 2, they understood what he was saying. So if you're a believer now in the presence of people who speak in tongues, you'll understand what they say. But when you're an elitist group like the Pentecostals, they're going to go, you don't understand me because you're not a believer, which is just ridiculous. There's nothing like it. When did Jesus ever do that? Never. That is another one of those very dumb very dumb doctrines. And if you read the scriptures where it speaks of tongues, it's always speaking to where people can understand you. It's saying it's important for people to be able to understand you. So in order for us to understand what was happening in Matthew chapter 5 and in Mark chapter 7 and also in Matthew, I can't remember the chapter right off, where there's this conflict between the traditions of the elders and these different the Judaizers and the Judaism that was going on. Jesus was against that, saying that y'all have made up y'all's own interpretations, y'all's own rules, and that's just like we see today. People follow these men, these different personalities that they like, and rather than read the scriptures and follow what Jesus has to say, they go and they'll get these commentaries and they'll get all of these different things, these different merchandise from these people who just sell Jesus. And the scriptures warn that they preach for filthy lucre, and it says that they'll make merchandise out of you through feigned words. They'll make merchandise out of you. It says the love of money is the root of all evil, and that's because they want fame, they want power, they want money. That's why they can afford the fancy clothes, they can afford the people to wait on their houses, and they can have big mansions and live deliciously, and they fleece the flock. That's one of the sayings, fleecing the flock. So we've discussed a large period of time from about 300 BC to about 500 AD, so about 800 years, and we needed to get an understanding there. And that's important to understand because it helps us know why they killed Jesus, and us being the body of Jesus and him as our head, understand why they persecute us today and put us through trials, and they mock us and scourge us and pick on us. If not literally all the time, they do it in a very they do it in very mean ways and cruel ways, with the backbiting and slander and destroying you behind your back. And that's why I always tell people to read The Prince by Niccolo Machiavelli, because it'll help you understand why people are so cruel. They choose favorites, and it's mean. And so that's what happened to Jesus. Is Jesus didn't try to be on the in crowd with the educated and the rulers. He went to the poor and the bruised and the brokenhearted and the crushed, and he helped pick them up. So Now we understand a little bit more about some of those time frames there. So I hope this helps. All right. Talk to y'all later. Bye.